All right, hi. Welcome to Dive into World Building, and this week's topic is parenting, and we've got somebody live tweeting, that's Reggie Lutz, and we've got somebody live parenting, that's Spencer Ellsworth. so, uh, so I think that's very appropriate for the hangout, and welcome everybody. So this was Spencer's topic that he requested, and Spencer, I'm so glad you asked for it, because I don't actually remember doing this topic, and we totally should have. But anyway, super glad to have you here, everybody. And well, okay, so when I was brainstorming this morning about the topic of parenting and world building and all this kind of stuff, I was thinking, well, the biggest problem I see with portrayals of parenting in fiction is that they don't exist. Okay. Okay, all right, let's kill off all the parents. I think that's so unfair. I think, in a way, we like to see our protagonists thrust into situations that they can't handle, and there's got to be some kind of big change in their lives to send them off on their quest or their mission to find themselves or whatever this happens to be. But yeah, killing off one or both parents seems to be like such a common thing. And I'm looking at my daughter who loves to, pretend play, and she'll be like, yes, and I'm an orphan, and I'm like, where is this coming from? And then I'm realizing it's coming from everywhere, right?
Yeah.
There's so many orphans, and there are so many other things. I mean, so I find it delightful when parents are actually alive, right? Because that means you actually get to delve into parenting, and you get to talk about what that's like. And I've often seen the story, so a few times I've seen the story of, the woman who is running from something and has a baby with her. If you're planning to write a story like that, viewers, beware. Okay? Do some research, because things like nursing and things like how much you have to eat and things like how much the baby has to sleep and that sort of thing are things to pay attention to if your woman is on the run with a baby. And boy, is she going to be tired. Right? Obviously, you can totally give some importance to she's in a desperate situation and she's gonna have to be able to run hard and do stuff, and she'd do anything to save the baby, and that's all true. But some of the physical aspects of parenting get pushed aside. So I want to open it up a little bit to thoughts from other people. What would you like to see done more in fiction in terms of parenting issues?
Well, you know what I think would be interesting if you could have a healthy child-parent relationship and make that interesting. Because we don't see a lot of that. The other thing that I notice in world building, and the thing is this is really a great source of conflict, and the light really needs to be shown on sort of abusive relationships to broaden our understanding and ways of coping when that's in real life. But I don't see a lot of that.
Yeah, there isn't a lot of healthy child-parent relationship. Certainly not. Yeah, well, there seem to be a lot of, I think part of it is that relationships with parents are very complex.
Yeah.
And unless that's the focus of the story, a lot of times people will try to say, well, we're just going to kind of skip over that. And I think that, okay, you can totally do that, but there are a lot of opportunities out there, I think, that are being lost for some really interesting parent relationships in stories.
Well, the other thing about a healthy child-parent relationship is that doesn't mean it lacks conflict either. Because, I mean, as we all know from our own family relationships, all kinds of crazy stuff comes up in families that are difficult, right?
Yeah.
Right. And you're always having, and one of the things that I notice with my kids is that there's always something new that you're having to take on jointly, right? That parents like to get engaged in the challenges that their children are facing, and so some of the conflict has to do with, you know, differences of opinion on how to handle this difficult thing, or, you know, is it possible for me to take this kind of advice, kind of stuff. There's a ton of complexity and conflict there, even when the two people are on the sort of ostensibly the same side, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the closer you are to someone, the more vulnerable you are to little things.
Yes.
If someone you don't care about says something, you just blow it off.
Right, absolutely. Right. So there's that. Communications can definitely be interesting. That's what Morgan is saying.
Yeah.
And well, you know, I think that one of the things that you can do with obviously I'm not. We'll get to the point where we can dive into some of the specifics about how to parent and how parenting is done with small children. But I think the role of the parent is really interesting. You know, is the parent expected to talk on a deep level with their kid? Is the parent expected to be an authority figure? Is the parent expected to be a hovering, protective presence? You know, even within our own society, we see a lot of different approaches to parenting, and all of them have advantages and disadvantages. So
Helicopter parents versus free-range kids.
you know, what it means to be a friend with your child. You know, whether that is something that would somehow be damaging to your authority as a parent, or whether that would be something that would help you convince them of things when you need to. You know, things like how to establish a relationship of mutual respect. You know, and you know, there's so many questions about parenting, because, like, just thinking about the helicopter friend authority kinds of roles for parents, there's so many different ways to parent, and I think there's so many different cultural influences in the way we parent. And I mean, people have whole reams and reams of discussion about whether it's okay to hit your kids, kind of thing, right? I mean, tons. People will argue for a whole day about that. So I mean, I don't think we can really jump into those discussions here, but I think that this is a very, I feel like this is a really unexplored territory in fiction, you know.
Well,
and unless you're dealing specifically with, yeah, I don't know, but like when you're going off and you're you know, making up some aliens, and, you know, do they have children? I mean, a lot of times you'll see the whole opposite problem, not kill off the parents, but, well, there are no children, right?
Yeah.
And so, for example, in the first story that I ever published at Analog, Let the Word Take Me, that was a story that was intended to kind of be a re-envisioning of this language concept that was invented in Star Trek: The Next Generation Starmock episode, where, you know, people are obliquely referring to things through sort of literary references and talking through story. And the thing that had always dissatisfied me about it was like I couldn't figure out how anybody would learn this, right? How do you learn it? Like, where are the stories? Are they told somewhere? Do we just extrapolate them based on our knowledge of these contextual usages? That always bothered me. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to write a story that's going to use the same language concept, but it's going to try to twist it in another direction. And so what I ended up doing was creating this society where...
Did we lose you?
Lost you for a minute.
Oh, am I there?
You're here now.
Okay. Sorry. So I don't know where I cut out. I'm sorry. Basically, in the society that I created there, the kids would speak in sign language, and that they would basically just, their role was to be listeners, and then they would go into this holy place, and in the holy place the stories could actually be told. And so their role in there was to listen and to repeat and to form a part of this grand sort of retelling and discussion of stories within that context, so that then when they grew up, they would then go out and find their own story and come back and go through a ceremony to be accepted as members of the speaking community. But the reason why you wouldn't speak unless you were licensed is because in the society the language itself was considered sacred, and so it was sort of, you know, if you spoke it unadvisedly, you know, its power would simply overwhelm you and burn out your brain, kind of idea, and so you have to protect yourself from its full glory and might by referring to it obliquely when you're not in the holy place, which is a place of protection and safety. So the point being that it was really important for me to put young of these aliens in the story. And as I was doing that, I was realizing how few times I'd actually seen young aliens in a context, in a parenting, in a sort of an upbringing context, in the stories that I'd read. Anyway, so sorry that I dropped out there for a second. Hopefully it wasn't too long.
That was just a moment.
Awesome. So let's see, what else? I mean, you can always go for inspiration if you're working with aliens. You can always go to animal species and do some research on how they rear their young. Yeah.
I've read a story somewhere, I can't place where it is, where it's a species that like lays hundreds of eggs, and they release them into the ocean.
Yeah.
And they're just like mindless. They consider them mindless and don't even think of them as their young until the ones that survive to a certain age then come back ashore. And then they're considered part of the species. Whereas that first stage where they're in the sea, they just don't even pay attention to them.
So this is from a story that you've read?
I read it somewhere. I can't call who it was or anything, but...
Well, you know what? That's fascinating, because I think questions of viability and you know, when a child becomes worthy of being raised are very fascinating and definitely apropos in our current culture. So yeah, so thanks for mentioning that. I was thinking of seahorses because of the way that the fathers are the ones who carry the young until they're ready to be born. So there are all kinds of interesting things you can do. Morgan's mentioning that sometimes you see nurseries, eggs, creches, no interaction with the children. Actually, you know what? That makes me think of nor Crystal Tears by Alan Dean Foster, where they had the sort of giant insect-like group, and then you had the human group, and they were terrified of each other, and the adults just refused to get along, so they kidnapped some babies and tried raising them together. So that was another interesting one. That is something that I have seen before. Sheila Finch also did a similar thing where, there was this alien species and we just couldn't communicate with them, and so the whole idea was, well, we have to be able to understand their language, so we're going to send a baby over there because babies learn languages better. And it's a very interesting choice, not without complications.
Yeah. But even if you're talking within human cultures, there's a lot of differences about, or you can do a lot with, okay, who is the parent? I've seen the term nurturing parent, which may not necessarily be, it could be the mother, it could be the father, it could be a grandparent. Different cultures are going to organize that different ways.
Right, and in fact, it reminds me of our discussion with Alia de Boda when she was talking about the significance of extended families.
Yeah.
Which she goes into a great deal in her Studia universe, which is based on Chinese and Vietnamese culture. So that's pretty fascinating too. And actually, there was another thing that I wanted to bring up, and Spencer, you might have some thoughts on this because you work more closely with Native American populations than I do. But when I was reading about, and then this was so long ago that I don't recall. Maybe it could have been Hopi, but anyway. So it was a Native American population, and somebody had gone in and tried to figure out how the babies learned to talk, basically, and there were a lot of cultural assumptions being brought in about the role of parents in teaching these children how to speak. And it turned out that the parents were hardly involved, and the parents, didn't speak to the kids because they weren't grown up enough and mature enough yet, and the parents didn't speak to the kids till they already knew how to speak. But it was the siblings and the cousins and other young people who were the primary interacting people, and the people who were responsible for the babies learning how to take their first steps into language. Does this sound familiar to you at all, Spencer?
I've only had one Hopi student up here in the Northwest. Most of my students are Lummi or Coast Salish culture.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe I've had two Hopi students. I can't speak. All I can speak to is just that most of the natives I know tend not to be as. If anyone here is of native extraction, maybe you could back this up. It's more common, in my experience, in native cultures, just not to be as displaced. You're closer to your extended family, you're closer to your homeland, your reservation, your reserve, or just traditional homeland in Alaska. I think most people of indigenous extraction would feel this way, and so you just part of a bigger extended family circle.
Mm-hmm.
Also, most of the natives I know come from bigger families on average than non-native families, too. Like, I'll tell my students that my parents had 6 kids, and the reaction is more often, oh, yeah, my parents had 7 or 8. Whereas, if I tell most people my parents had 6 kids, they say, were they trying to get themselves killed? That's more of a white cultural reaction there.
Right.
So I would... when you're writing fantasy, and you're trying to go to a culture that's more subsistence, that's going to be family-based, a small group, either a small group on the move or like just a small village, like Robert Jordan's starts
Mm-hmm.
out with a very small village where everyone's in each other's business. Anytime you write fantasy, I think it's important to consider the big families, lots of kids intermarried over years. Anytime you're writing about a small group, and not just fantasy, I guess science fiction colony worlds would get there the same way. And any subsistence culture is going to have a lot of the work that we picture parents doing, because parents, we have a luxury, we have a luxury now of letting teenagers be teenagers. That's kind of a luxury compared to when teenagers were surrogate parents for the additional kids who were coming up.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that was probably because in my great grandfather's generation, or three great great grandfather's generation, when a lot of children died, and when a lot of children died, and there was no retirement. Retirement's also an idea of the 20th century, I think. Then you wanted to have a lot of kids, and you wanted to spread them out because you wanted your youngest kids to be taking care of the farm when you were hitting your 60s and 70s, but you wanted the oldest kids to be around when you're in your 20s and 30s to also help with the farm. So I sort of went off on that. But
No,
yeah,
that's good.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's, yeah, I mean, I think it's great because you just brought up the question of how many children do you commonly have, and that is a huge question, and it has everything to do with the kind of environment that people are being raised in. I'm going to check out Morgan's comment here. Yeah, okay, so what I was going to say is that there was a point, this is not Morgan's point, but so there was a point when people were talking about getting people to have smaller families to try to reduce population boom and stress on the earth and that kind of thing. And there was this belief where you'd say, well, if you give people the opportunity to have smaller families, they're just going to do it. But that's not actually the case. And it depends on a lot of factors like the ones that Spencer was talking about, which basically are things like, what do you need in order to keep your family going and to make sure everybody eats and to keep the farm going or whatever it is you happen to be doing, right? If you're a person who is going off to work in an office all day, then who's caring for the kids, right? I mean, we have a totally different parenting situation here where, often daycare people are raising the kids. And there's been this shift where suddenly there's all this emphasis on, well, how teachers have to have this central role in raising kids. Well, it's partly because of the people who are just trying to make ends meet and working 2 and 3 jobs, both parents, right? And parents are supporting their kids monetarily, but they're hardly able to see them. Child rearing becomes a completely different kind of thing. So, which is to say, I'm not trying to distract from Spencer's point, but I'm trying to say that there's this huge cultural network of the climate, the environment, how people make a living. This is jobs, which we talked about just a couple weeks ago, and all these different factors that pile into how practical it is to have children and whether it's a good idea to have lots or just to have a few, or and then of course there's also the question of is there birth control? What does that look like? But families can take all kinds of different shapes. And we have talked about families at different points, but but yeah, so those are things also to think about.
And you can get an interesting transitional thing there too, where you take people who have been traditionally in a culture where it makes sense to have lots of kids, and bring them forward, for sake of a better word, into a more contemporary setting where it would economically make sense for them to have fewer kids, but because they've got the cultural tradition,
right,
it can take several generations to catch up.
And cultural traditions are something that's very important to people, and they change slowly. Yeah, so that makes perfect sense.
We have a whole different world that we live in than our parents and our grandparents lived in. We have the information that's flowing is changing the patterns of parenting, because and all sorts of information is flowing to children as they're growing up that would have been unimaginable 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, by the way, before I forget, I want to just say something. When I was minoring in psychology at the University of California in Berkeley, someone did some really interesting experiments with babies, almost newborns, not quite, but 1 to 2 year old. They put a microphone basically in the cribs and recorded them all night, and they found that they gave themselves language lessons. They
practice.
Yeah, they would practice while you thought they were asleep.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, so I want to catch up on the chat bar a little bit here. Okay. Here, this is the one I wanted to pick up on. Parenting advice being shared with parents from outside sources, and who is licensed to give parenting advice? That is a great question. And the minute you get pregnant as a woman, all of a sudden you're fair game to everybody, right? I mean, like, all you have to do is show up being visibly pregnant, and people are like, "You pregnant? Hey, let me tell you how this works," right? You know, they'll tell you about how you're supposed to behave as a pregnant person. They'll give you parenting advice. They will, So like, boundaries, I guess, is sort of the question. Where are the boundaries surrounding a parent and their child? Because I know that those are very, very closely felt too. I mean, when there are times when I see a kid and doing something that I really don't approve of, and I think to myself, well, is it okay for me to try to interact with this kid, or am I crossing a forbidden boundary because only their parent is allowed to interact with them? Or, you know, is it possible for me to talk with this child as though the child is an autonomous individual who would be able to understand some of my concerns, which is usually my approach, because I don't like to take the role of stepping in and pretending to be a parent to another person's child. But it's not without its difficulties, because sometimes people are just really not okay with you talking with their child, even if you're trying to treat the child as though they're not your own, but a separate person, like a colleague or a friend to whom you would like to speak about something that they might have been up to, right? So that is a really interesting, complex thing.
Well, I can say as a person who doesn't have children, but I have a lot of friends who do have children, that very often, in terms of interacting, particularly when they're very small, I sometimes I'm like, I have no idea what to do with myself. when, like, let's say, like, when the child does something like run away from the adult group, and like you have to go chase them, and then say that the adult parent has their attention pulled in different directions, and see it, and I'm like very cognizant of like, okay, I'm not in a parental role here. What do I do? What are the rules? For me, non-parent and a non-relative.
So, yeah. All I'm going to say is I don't think that question can be answered, but it's a really fascinating question for somebody to try to engage with in a fictional world and in storytelling.
But I think that there are like taboos around adult-child relationships who are non-relatives. That would be something to explore, I think, with parenting and world building. And how much of that is individual decision-making versus cultural expectation.
Yeah.
I wonder if that response that you talked about, with respect to seeing a pregnant person, I wonder if that creates some kind of instinctual social response that adds to the wanting to, butt in, basically.
There is the whole "it takes a village" thing, and I think that there are plenty of cultures, and I think also it would apply to small communities where everybody's got these important jobs that they got to do to keep life going, and so the kids are at a bit of a loose end, and one is expected just to sort of, if they're getting in trouble, keep an eye on them or whatever it is, if you happen to be within their range, as it were. So I think there are communities where communal parenting or just sort of a general sense of joint responsibility for the community's children happen. I'm not sure whether that was grammatical, but anyway, I think it's a good thought anyway.
Daddy.
Yeah.
In terms of knowing how to behave in a lot of the situations, a lot of it depends on experience. In other words, I've got so much experience with children. My wife ran a really wonderful daycare for over 20 years, and I've run into almost every conceivable kind of social situation. I'm just so comfortable with it, and I think that parents out in the world, if I interact with their kids, somehow sense that, and they don't. I've never had anyone seem to object or pull back or look at me oddly if I was interacting with their child.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I haven't had anybody freak out or anything negative. It's just that internal, like, I'm not sure how to behave here sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very cautious about touching other people's kids, but talking to them, like you say, blocking an escape route of a small child.
Yeah, I've done that. I did that for a very harried lady in the grocery store not too long ago.
Yeah.
I just basically put myself in the path of the child and got down on the child's level and said, "Hi!" And the kid went, boom, and stopped.
Exactly.
There, a chance to catch up. So I totally, I mean, there's the whole like wall approach, but also trying to engage their attention and see if they might stop to pay attention to you is probably helpful as well.
Yeah, I had an occasion recently in the grocery store where a child was going down one aisle and the mother was looking for them in the other aisle, and I was standing where I could see both of them. So I was like, "She's over here."
I'm sure that was much appreciated, Glenda. There's another thing. One of the things that I discovered when I became a parent is that there is a sort of unspoken sisterhood of moms. That if you have been a parent, you have a very different sort of cultural feel to you, and there's a sort of a bond that you feel with other people who also have this strange thing in common with you, that they may have no cultural commonalities in the way that they parent, but somehow that you feel a bond with other parents simply because they're parents, right? And especially, I mean, I think what it has to do with is how you have these things where people have these initiation ceremonies, and okay, we've got this thing where there's this ritual, and then there are these trials that you have to go through, and then at the end of it, everybody who's gone through it feels like they've created a new bond and whatever. And I think that when you're not sleeping for like a year, or when you're frantic and completely overstimulated, and you look at somebody else and they go, I totally get it, that there's this feeling of connection with that, and it's hard to describe. And I remember feeling like there was a huge difference between who I was before I was a mom and who I was after I was a mom, and it was really hard to put my finger on, because I could have described a lot of things about what I imagined parenting would be like, and yet the actual experience of doing it was so completely absorbing and different that I knew that I really had not known very much before it actually happened to me. So that would be something also to explore.
There's also a secret society of grandparents. Oh,
Yes.
Are any of you grandparents?
Not yet.
At this moment, I have another grandchild being born. That'll be the fourth. And
wow.
There's a tremendous connection. There's all sorts of secret things that you learn when you're a grandparent. The whole business of the grandparents spoiling the kids, absolutely. That's our job.
Well, I mean, I think that grandparents can have a really important role, and Morgan was mentioning the whole it takes a village and the neighbors take the kids for a couple of hours so you can sleep. Yeah, totally. Also grandparents, right? I happen to be in the situation where my parents are on the other side of the country, and my husband's parents were in Australia, and so we just basically didn't have the grandparental support when our kids were small. In terms of child care, right? I mean, in terms of all kinds of other things, sure. But it definitely changes the whole dynamic when you've got a larger family structure. And this is, again, going back to what Alia de Boda was talking about, is that when you have extended families, and Spencer was talking about it too, when you have extended families, the dynamic is vastly different. And it's not something that you see very commonly in fiction, the extended family, and the extended family dynamic with all of its complexities in fiction. So yeah.
I think a lot of these things you can find in literary fiction. It seems like in genre fiction there are, particularly because it explores alternative cultures, made-up cultures, that there's really a big opportunity that is lost by not exploring these kinds of relationships in the extended family.
Yeah.
I think you bring up a really good point about that. Those differences, applying that to genre fiction.
Yeah, and
that
that's
makes
a really
sense.
important point. Yeah, absolutely. Because there are a lot of family dynamic explorations of various types in literary fiction. Though I haven't seen a ton of extended families, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, I think that the family has definitely been something that has explored. In genre we have a lot of quests, And quests often involve leaving everything you know and going off on a, I'd love to see like a whole extended family go on quests together. Can somebody write that for me? Okay, let's go on a quest. But,
well, I mean, you have that in fiction.
On the subject of, have you read The Lonely Polygamist by Brady Udo?
No.
Yeah, he is. I'm still live parenting. This is interesting because I think a lot of the literary fiction I've read lately it's very similar to fantasy more than anything else I read, because it takes how that is different. And this book, I'd highly recommend if you're interested in dynamics of parenting and world building. The Lonely Polygamist is about a man with 4 wives who lives in a it's not an abusive situation. It's very much a look at a bunch of people who willingly went out in the for a wife family, and he has it's set in the 1970s, and they live in this land that is all irradiated from old nuclear bomb tests, and he's it's all a situation that really occurred, but it's a great look at how a very different family dynamic in a different situation choose to be in. I think it's weird. The best literary fiction novels I've read in the last few years, going all the way back to The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, had really good world building. They were not set. They weren't John Updike types set in every town in America. And I think that's probably what the other one was set in a real locale and was about real people, and nothing happened because of magic. But boy, it had great world building and great setting work.
Well, I mean, I believe that world building can it's a word that I like to use across genres. I don't think it's something that should be exclusive to worlds that are not ours. So yes, exactly. I mean, there is no world on a blank piece of paper or on a blank computer file. So no matter what you're writing, you are building a world, and that involves building the kinds of ways that people perceive that world as well. So I'm noticing chat happening. What's wagon train?
Oh, what Morgan said about extended family on a quest and traveling with an infant and.
Oh, okay. Yeah, absolutely, it would. But I like your wagon train idea. I mean, I think there are stories like that, right? Extended family on a quest, wagon train across the America. Yeah, sure. There are stories like that.
The show Wagon Train.
Yeah. Let's send it across an alien planet now. That'll be fun. or off to. But it's funny because you think to yourself, well, what kind of a quest would an extended family be on? And that opens up a whole other type of topic, right? Like, what would they want that they would pack up and go do? So, looking for a new place to live is obviously one that works out. This occurs. Looking for a place where your family can live and practice their faith without being persecuted for it. I'm totally down with that one. Yeah. I couldn't see an extended family going to destroy a ring inside a mountain. On the other hand, I think there are things that they could be inspired to do.
Well, if it was a nomadic culture to begin with,
yeah, sure.
Then the idea of the whole family going off to accomplish some specific task would work.
Mm-hmm. Well, so okay. Let's see what else.
Or to explore new industries that are geographically located somewhere else.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
I wanted to spit that out before I forgot.
Well, I mean, I think explore new industries. I mean, in a sense, my parents have had a quest that involves them going to be wherever my dad works, because his work is very specific and can only be done in particular types of contexts. Right? And so if he's looking for a job, he's automatically looking for a job throughout the whole country, because there are so few of these particular types of jobs, namely university administrator, that you just can't say, well, I'm just going to stay in my hometown and change jobs. It's not how it works. So at that point, we the kids were already out of the house. But yeah, so that was a interesting change of venue.
Military families.
Military families, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. And Morgan is suggesting maybe that there was an object that was a threat to a particular family rather than to everyone in the world, or generationships.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've read I was thinking there's a number of stories that are family groups on spaceship.
Yeah. And Reggie's got a good one too. Escaping the social environment of scandal, I guess. Escaping a tight-knit social environment where you can't live things down, I guess.
Yeah.
So let's talk for a second more. I mean, we're getting towards the end of our time, which is totally fine. I just want to see what else we can cover here. So Morgan's got something. At what age might a child stop moving to be with their parents? Spouses tend to move with each other. Young children have to move with them, but teens don't always want to do that. Okay, so yeah, so parents moving and the children not moving with them. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that ties into the question of when do children actually gain autonomy, and that's another completely different and very interesting topic that I'm glad you brought up, because in the U.S. there's this very common cultural thread that doesn't obviously apply to everybody, but it's this sort of, well, you've finished high school and now you're going off to college, right? And it's this big sort of transition between childhood and adulthood. In Australia, people don't typically live on campus even if they go to college. And so what you'll have is it'll be different. It'll they'll stay living at home while they're in college, and then gradually, while they're working on their college degree, they'll maybe move out into an apartment or something. But there isn't this sort of grand point where, okay, we're going off to college now. It's not spoken about in that way.
Well, even in the U.S., there's a lot of socioeconomic variability there.
That's right. Right. That was what I was going to get to next, because not everybody goes to college, and are you in a situation where you're in a family business, for example, and how does recognition of adulthood happen in that context, right?
I think this could be a whole new topic for maybe next week.
Yeah, I have a topic scheduled for next week. I'm not sure what it is. But I'll look. I will look. I will be able to figure this out.
Okay. But I think the autonomy question of when a child, that's really interesting in terms of world building with what that means for culture. Do you become autonomous at 12? Do you become autonomous,
Never.
Yeah.
Right?
Or when you marry, or...
I'm going to put autonomy as a topic, because I think that's really, really cool. So we'll explore that at some point. But next week is going to be senses, alien senses, and
Cool.
and human senses and world building. So that would be something that we can kind of brainstorm on. I think we should wrap up at this point. So thank you all for coming. Are there any last-minute thoughts that you want to supply here for just to pique some thought on the part of anybody who might watch this video? We've done a lot already, so I think it's pretty cool. Spencer, any more thoughts?
No, I like your idea of a extended family going on a quest. Always.
Yeah, I'm like, I want to write that now.
Yeah.
I did have in fantasy they tend to use a lot of transgressive acts like killing someone, using their blood for magic, and there's always there's a lot of common stories where the most transgressive act is where someone kills their own child for the power or whatever. But it's interesting to me that there's a history in going back to that book I read, The Lonely Polygamist, made me think of this. There's a history in American religious traditions of getting power from having family. That's a lot of the that was a lot of the original idea of Mormon polygamists, was that you got more power the more family you got.
Right.
See, if someone could come up with a fantasy system where your magical powers are based on the extent of your family.
Daddy, what's your tree?
Oh, that is cool. Yeah.
I only have one piece of that one, buddy. Sorry, I'm still live parenting.
But your live parenting has made the whole hangout much more interesting and three-dimensional and apropos. So, so thank you for sticking with us. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate you adding those last thoughts because that's really, really cool. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to stop the broadcast. Thanks, everybody who watched, and thank you all for coming. And next week's topic is going to be senses, like, seeing, hearing, and possibly other things as well. And we'll see you next week.